Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is from the incredible mind of Sugar-Soad from over on Reddit, No Sleep. And as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story. Entitled, My grandfather fought in the Emu Wars, and he watched dozens of soldiers get massacred by those psychotic birds. Let's get straight into that. My grandfather was one of the sweetest men that ever lived. He would always have a big smile on his face, and everyone loved him. And I have only seen him angry one time in my life. It actually scared me to see him like that. I had discovered a story about something called the Emu Wars, where soldiers used to hunt down emus, and I was laughing about how ridiculous it sounded. My grandfather started screaming at me and telling me not to talk about something that I knew nothing about. He stormed out of the house while I stood there, shaking in fear. A couple of days later, he returned to our house to apologize for screaming at me. He could see the confusion on my face, and I could tell how terrible he felt. I apologized for making fun of the Emu Wars, as I just thought that it was funny. He told me to sit down as he wanted to share his experiences with me. And I sat down and waited as he began to tell his tale. I had joined the military when I was 18, as I had been living with an abusive father, and this seemed like the perfect way to escape. I completed basic training and was assigned to the base. And there was very little to do on a daily basis, and so we were constantly just training and having fun. Our base commander was an old soldier who didn't care about what happened, as long as no one did anything stupid. One morning, we were called out for an assembly, and we were all quite excited as we hoped we might get some action. But you could see the evident disappointment on everyone's faces as we were told that we were being mobilized to deal with a herd of emus. They were causing trouble for farmers, and we were being sent to cull them, and we were told to be ready at 1200 the next morning. Everyone was giddy the next morning, as it seemed like a fun excursion. There were about 325 of us loaded into trucks as we headed out. It was a long, tedious journey, and the mood quickly darkened as the heat slowly wore down everyone's mood. There was very little to look at in any direction, with only an occasional house. We finally stopped after almost an 8-hour journey, and I could see the relief on the other guys' faces as we jumped off the trucks. My legs were aching for not moving for so long, and I had to stretch for a minute to get some feeling in them. We were in a remote location with nothing to see in any direction. Our base commander approached us and explained that a herd of emus was seen about 10 miles from here. We would need to walk to get there, as the terrain was very bad. He left about 50 of us back with the trucks, while the rest of us marched along. We finally reached the summit of a steep hill and gazed down to see about 250 emus on the far side. The commander ordered us to set up our weapons. We all set up and awaited the order to fire. I was a very good shooter and lined up my rifle on one of the closest birds. The sound was deafening as we all opened fire. I watched as my bullet destroyed half of the face of the bird I had been aiming at. Their gaze all turned on us and seemed to be challenging us. The bird I had shot seemed to be glaring at me, and with its one good eye. A few of the other soldiers took a few steps backwards as the stares from the birds made them feel uncomfortable. The commander ordered us to fire again and stop being such cowards. And once again, I targeted the same bird and watched in amazement as it somehow dodged a bullet at the last possible moment. Somehow, with all the bullets we fired, only 10 or so of the animals lay on the ground dead. And I could see the hatred in their eyes as they gazed up at us. The commander was given the order to fire another round when the animals suddenly took off running in the opposite direction. We stood there for a few moments, watching them disappear off into the horizon. We were finally ordered to pack up our stuff as it was starting to get dark. We marched back in a disorderly fashion and were constantly on our guard as we could hear running feet on all sides. The emus kept appearing in small groups for a few moments before running away after we opened fire. I could hear the fear in the commander's voice as he ordered us to stop firing as we were just wasting bullets. We kept stopping for breaks as the rest of the company was scared and needed to go to the toilet all the time. I was almost pitch black when we arrived back to the trucks and we were met by scenes of carnage. The bodies of soldiers that were left behind were strewn about the site with their insides ripped out. The trucks had been savagely attacked as there were evident scrapes and dents on all of them. Whatever had attacked them had taken them completely by surprise, as many of them didn't have their guns in their hands. We were all standing there frozen in terror when one of the emus walked out of the shadows and began plucking out the eye from one of the bodies. I raised my gun to shoot at it, but it ran off before I could get a shot off, and we stood there, not speaking for a few moments, until the commander ordered us to set up a defensive ring and drag the bodies out of the way. Everyone began rushing around in pandemonium as we were just so freaked out. It took us almost an hour to move the bodies and then set up a defense around the trucks. I don't think that any of us got much sleep that night, as we were all on edge. I was awoken the next morning by panicked voices. I pushed myself off the rough ground and walked over to see what was going on. I listened to the conversation to discover that all the bodies were missing and something had dragged them all off when we weren't paying attention. Now the commander told us to stop panicking and jump into the trucks so we can get the fuck out of here. We rushed to gather up our supplies and jumped into the back of the trucks. And there was a sense of relief on people's faces as we knew we were finally getting away from this god-forsaken place. The relief was short-lived though, as none of the trucks would start. The damage that had been inflicted on them had rendered them useless. We stood around deciding what to do when a scream made us all spin around. My mouth hung agape as I gazed at the thousands of emus that had somehow snuck up on us and now surrounded us on all sides. We all began to back up against each other in a vain attempt to get away from them. I recognized the bird I had shot earlier as it stood front and center amongst the others. His face had been crippled by my bullet and his eyes seemed to be glowing. It turned around and all the other birds followed its lead. None of us had even thought to raise our guns as we were just so terrified. It took a few minutes for everyone to relax as we were all still huddled together. The commander grabbed a map and discovered the nearest town was about 6 days' walk from there. Most of our food supplies had been destroyed, so we were ordered to grab anything that was salvageable and prepare to march. It took a lot longer to get ready than usual, as people were fighting over food and water. It almost resulted in fistfights, but the commander managed to calm everyone down by pointing out that we had bigger concerns. Eventually we started marching in a very complex fashion, as we were all trying to use others as cover in case of another attack. We were constantly being hounded by the emus, as they would suddenly appear in the distance before quickly disappearing from sight. We were all constantly on edge as we had never seen anything like it. Now, we had probably been marching for 3 hours when the attack began. They just came out of nowhere and there were hundreds of them. I watched as one of them knocked the person beside me to the ground and then used its claws to rip out his throat. The attack was so sudden that many of us hadn't even had a chance to reach for our guns. I had managed to grab my gun and killed the closest emu to me when I was about to fire on another bird, but they all suddenly fled. We lost another 40 soldiers in this attack. My kill had been the only confirmed emu kill. There were a few injuries, but nothing severe, so we continued to march after grabbing supplies from the corpses. And everyone walked along with their weapons ready in case of another attack. It slowly began to dawn on us that we might not make it out of this alive. We set up a camp that night with 25 guards on rotating shifts. I had the first shift and I could hear noises in the distance as they seemed to be circling us. I laid down on the ground after my shift and fell asleep instantly due to the exhaustion. And I was awoken by screams all around us and the sound of rushing feet. I grabbed my gun to discover the emus were launching hit-and-run attacks on us. I heard a noise behind me and spun around and fired my gun. And I watched in horror as I looked at the commander's face and noticed the blood pouring out of the gunshot wound in his throat. And he collapsed to the ground while the screams of agony and fear surrounded me. The next morning, we discovered we had lost another 57 men. 5 of them had died from friendly fire, and I was thankful that no one realized I was responsible for the commander's death. We began to march, but it was obvious that many of us seemed like they had already given up. And the next few days were chaotic, as we were being attacked every few minutes. There were less than 15 of us left alive at this point, as the damn birds killed anyone that they could get close to. We had passed numerous houses as we marched, but we discovered that all of the inhabitants had been slaughtered by the birds. The bird I had shot at the start was always watching me from a distance, and I felt like he was mocking me. Soon we were barely able to stand, and I suggested that we take cover inside the next house, as we can grab cover inside. It took us an hour to reach the next house, which was a 2-story. We quickly used what we could find in the house to try and make a house more secure. We pushed furniture in front of the windows and used wood to barricade the doors shut. We were running desperately low on ammo, as most of our supplies had been lost in our march. We grabbed knives and whatever else we could find to use as alternative weapons. We all looked at each other with a look of defeat, as we all knew that this was going to be our last stand. We set ourselves up in different positions around the house in the hopes of holding out for as long as possible. We knew we didn't stand a chance against these demonic creatures, as they seemed hellbent on wiping us out. The hammering at the outside of the building started just after it got dark, and it was coming from all sides as the emus tried to force a way in. I heard the sounds of sporadic gunfire from upstairs as they fired down on top of them. It took less than an hour for them to get inside. We tried to use a choke point in front of them so that we could kill them. Unfortunately, this only worked for a minute or two as they breached the house from multiple locations. I was forced to retreat up the stairs and watched as they slaughtered everyone on the bottom floor. I locked myself in a bedroom and knew that I would probably die in there. I had lost my gun while fleeing, and now my only weapon was a kitchen knife. The creatures had made their way upstairs, and I could hear screams quickly being cut off in the other rooms. Everything was now deathly silent as I awaited my fate. I was near exhaustion and must have dozed off. I awoke the next morning to silence and wondered what had happened. I opened the door to find the house soaked with blood but devoid of bodies. I made my way downstairs and walked out of the front door. And I froze in my steps and felt my bladder release as I gazed out the door. Thousands of emus stood outside, and they all gazed at me. The emu I had shot stood at the very front, and he seemed to be smiling with what was left of his face. And they suddenly all moved, and a small gap opened up in between their ranks. And I cautiously moved forward, as I feared they just intended to surround and kill me. After I made it through, they suddenly ran off into the other direction. It took me another 2 days to finally reach someone living. It took me another week to get back to my base. No one believed me at first, and a number of high-ranking officers arrived as they wanted to know how many soldiers could just disappear. They organized another mission with over 1,000 heavily armed soldiers. They brought spare trucks to hopefully rescue any other survivors. I kept getting weird looks from other soldiers as they thought that I was somehow responsible for this. They stopped looking at me like this as we started passing the blood-soaked locations where we had been attacked. We eventually reached the trucks that we had originally used, and were shocked to discover the mutilated bodies of the soldiers that had accompanied me. The officers looked bewildered, as they didn't know how to react to this sight. They all stood there with their mouths hanging agape as the hordes of emus suddenly surrounded us. They were soaked in blood and seemed to be challenging us. The officers quickly began issuing orders, and the soldiers began to gather up the remains and load them into the trucks. We left the site as quickly as we possibly could, while the emus watched from a distance. The military made up a ton of bullshit to cover up what happened and paid off the soldiers' families. I was then forced out of the army and threatened with prison if I ever said anything to anyone. I gazed at my grandfather in shock as he sat there weeping. He made me swear that I wouldn't say a word of this while he was still alive. I kept my promise as he passed away a few years ago, and I finally decided to share his tale. Be careful of emus, as there is something not quite right about them. Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. Something a little bit different there, a break from the norm. And of course, as ever, a big thank you to the incredible author, Sugar-Soad, from over on Reddit, No Sleep. Really enjoyed your story, and I certainly look forward to more of your work in the future. Well, guys and girls, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to have a crack at things like myself, then please do get in touch with me at the contact email, which is, as on screen, contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope you're all well and happy, fighting fit, and having a great start to the new year. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.